Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm honoured to be speaking with John O'Sullivan. John, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Dan, thank you so much for having me on, man. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm super excited because we're doing a bit of role reversal here. I've been on your podcast show, Way of Champions, a couple of times, indeed. I've been honoured to be on twice now.
You're part of the handful.
Yeah.
The handful who's made it on twice.
That's my head is growing as we speak. That's awesome. Wow. It's great to be doing the questioning, asking the questions, and having you on the Sports Psych Show. And we've timed it really, really well because I know you've just released a book, and we're going to be talking about that for the next hour or so, and digging into some of your thoughts on the coaching world. But I think, look, probably most of the Sports Psych Show audience know who you are and listen to the Way of Champions podcast. If they don't, what are you doing? You need to be listening to that podcast. But what would be great, John, is if you give us a bit of a potted biography as to who you are, where you've been, and what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So, I am as you said, the host of the Way of Champions podcast, and I run an organization called Changing the Game Project, which I started in 2012. Before that, I was an athlete, a football player, a soccer player in the States, collegiately. I played professionally for a little while, had a couple of bad injuries, and decided I really loved the game and wanted to coach. And so I went into coaching and coached high school level, coached university here in the United States and the NCAA, and then on the youth level. And for many years, that's really where I found my passion. I really love working with sort of like 11 to 14-year-old kids. I just think it's such a great age to develop them, to watch them grow as human beings, to go through a really tough time in their life, and have hopefully a strong mentor and role model at that time. And so that's my coaching side. And then obviously with Changing the Game Project, we do consulting with tons of different organizations, from the U.S. Olympic Committee and many of the sport governing bodies in the United States, probably about a dozen to 24 of them at this point, and then lots of clubs and schools, and internationally. I mean, I just got back from working with Rugby League in Australia, and I'm off to work with the Ski Federation in Italy here as well. So, that takes me all over the world, working with coaches, working on parent education, coach education, leadership development, things like that. And then when I find the time, I get great guests like yourself and talk to them and go deep and learn more and add to my toolbox on the Way of Champions podcast. So that's the 30,000-foot overview of my day jobs.
You're a busy man. Now, I'm throwing you a little bit of a curveball, actually, because you said you played professional sport. You were a professional soccer player. When you reflect back, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good were you at the mental side of the game?
It's a great question, because certainly I'm 48 now. So when I was playing, and I was done by the time I was 26, I think, I was, none of that was any part of it, right? It certainly was not part of my university experience at a Division I college, and it was not part of I played in a league called the USL here in the U.S., and, that was not a part of it. I think that I had a strong character and was very competitive, and things. But one of the things, with these injuries, getting through the injuries, right, when you're physically better, you're never mentally better, right? And my first bad injury was a really bad, Eduardo type tib-fib fracture, and so when you're back on the field, you're not back in your head. And I don't know that I ever got over that, and struggled with a few things after that, and then was done playing. So I think as a young player, I was very strong mentally. But after a couple bad injuries, I don't know. I really could have I really could have used some help at that point for sure.
Sure, absolutely, and I want to part that. I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to link that to the first chapter, the first couple of chapters in your book that you've just written. So neat segue there. You've written a book. It's entitled "Every Moment Matters: How the World's Best Coaches Inspire Their Athletes and Build Championship Teams." Exciting times, John. What brought you to writing this book?
Yeah, so man, I'm so excited about the book. It just came out in December of 2019, and for me, I've been wanting to write this coaching book because when I travel and work with coaches with Change the Game Project, I wrote my first book and came out in December of 2013 called Changing the Game. And the subtitle of it was, the parent's guide, but it was really for coaches as well. And a lot of coaches obviously are also parents. So it was applicable, but someone said, the stuff that you're teaching us as coaches, do you have a book for that? And so I've been wanting to write this for a while. And a couple of years ago, I was going to put pen to paper, and then I started the Way of Champions podcast. And the quality of the guests that I was able to get and talk to made me press pause on the book because I said, man, this stuff is all going in the book. And so, at this point, almost 150 or so episodes into the podcast, we've talked to 2 World Cup winners, over 100 NCAA championships, Steve Kerr, who's won 8 NBA titles as a player and a coach, and some others, lined up here in the future. And so I've learned so much from these coaches that's really finally 2 years into that. I was like, all right, now I've got the interviews for this book. Right. And if I can take everything that I've learned, because Dan, like when you have a podcast, you're doing it to serve the people who listen to you and follow you, but you're also learning so much on your own. And I know you're like me, you've got a page of notes after every episode, and you're always adding to your own toolbox. And so that's what I was doing and incorporating these things into my own coaching. And so when I finally did put this book down, it reflects a lot of the common themes, and certainly the title "Every Moment Matters" is one of the most common themes that as a coach, you never know if today's the day that kid, that athlete is ready to listen, is ready to be impacted. And you never know if the things you say or do in this moment will stick with them for the rest of your life. So you have to always be on. You have to be ready. You don't get a day off. That's the burden that you take on as a coach, but it's also the privilege because you can impact so many people. And so that's kind of how the title came about is, how do you be intentional about every one of these moments? And of all these coaches that came on the podcast and that I've gotten to meet and talk to over the years, that was probably the most common theme, and therefore it became the title of the book.
No, I love it. Every Moment Matters, and it sort of makes me think of one of the books I wrote, and how I wrote that, for me, coaching is one of the toughest hobbies or professions you can actually engage in, because you're dealing with different wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, expectations, etc. And because you're dealing with complexity, as your title suggests, every moment matters. I love that. And you've talked about your podcast there, and I completely agree. It's just incredible having a podcast and listening to so many different worldviews. And John, I go around the country here, and I travel abroad as well to work, and I'm accompanied by several podcasts, one of which is yours, Way of Champions. I love listening every week to the Way of Champions and learning. And that's what I love about your book. I've dived in, and that's what we're going to talk about today, but I've dived in, and I repeatedly say to people now as a psychologist, I'm more of a sense maker, or I feel I'm more of a sense maker, especially for coaches, than anything else. And if I was to sum up your book in, is sense making one word or 2 words? I might get this wrong here, but this book.
I didn't edit my book, Dan.
Yeah, I feel your pain with that one, certainly. When you don't know if sense making is 2 words or 1 word, you definitely know you need an editor. But look, it was just brilliant sense making, and I've read through it, and I just recall some of the interviews that you've given from some of the people who feature in this book, and I love that. And you've introduced great stories, and it's across all sports again, which I love. So it's absolutely fantastic. And I'd like to go through it, and I know you've separated this into three parts. Part one, why do I coach? Part two, how do I coach? Part three, how does it feel to be coached by me? And I've picked a few chapters out. Each chapter is a lesson. You've got 17 lessons. And so starting with part one, why do I coach? Lesson one is to be a better coach, be a better you. And I'm like, wow, this is awesome, because, you know, for me as a sports psychologist, I'm talking about self-awareness, self-skills all the time. And I think this is what you're referring to here, to become aware of who you are and what characteristics you bring to the table and how that influences your own coaching behaviors.
Exactly. And I think, you know, oftentimes, you know, and so that idea, right? All the chapter titles in the book are based on a quote or an idea from someone far smarter than me, and so that idea of to be a better coach, be a better you, comes from a great author, writer, former NFL player named Joe Ehrmann, who wrote a book, Inside Out Coaching, about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago now, which is one of my favorite books. And you know, so in that regard, I think, you know, that's the foundation, right? And oftentimes I think in coaching education, when we decide to be a coach, we start with the how, we start with the tactics and the techniques and the X's and O's. But when you really dive into what are the qualities of a great coach, they're these psychosocial qualities. They're the ability to, they all go under the ability or under the heading of connection or emotional intelligence. And so that, I think, really starts with me. And if I know me, I know my passion, I know my purpose of why do I coach, you know, was it Nietzsche, right? If I, you know, he who has a strong why can endure anyhow, right? And so I think burnout from coaching comes with when you get too far away from, you know, your why. And that's why I started that with the first chapter of, like, really think about your why and why are you here and why do you do what you do? Because if you're strong there, you can deal with all the things that coaching is going to throw at you, because it's going to throw out a lot of stuff at you, regardless of whether you're working with 8-year-olds or 28-year-olds.
Well, John, you know, you start with a really open and honest story about yourself as a young coach. And I'd love you to tell us a little bit about that, or regale us with that story, because it's a kind of a John O'Sullivan I couldn't even begin to believe is true or ever existed. So I'd love to hear about that. And you know, going actually back to the beginning of the podcast and how we talked about you not experiencing psychology at college. My question to you is, once you've told us about that story, can you tell us whether that perhaps links to a lack of experience around the psychosocial sides of the game when you grew up basically competing?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So, you know, the story I start, and I think there's a lot of stories in the book that I share from, obviously, coaches and athletes far greater than myself, but also personal ones. And, you know, this is one of them. And I was probably, you know, I was in my late 20s or so, and I was coaching NCAA Division I soccer, but also coaching a youth team at the time. And we were, you know, the state champions, and we were at the regional tournament, and we had lost our first 2 games. We were already eliminated. We had to play our third game and then go home. And, you know, it's summer, it's hot, it's humid. The kids are not happy, and I was just miserable. And we're losing our last game by a couple of goals, and I was just giving this kid such a hard time. And, you know, he had ability. He was tall, he was strong, but he was just getting beat on every play, and I was just hammering him. And finally, I just yanked him out of the game. And I'm like, you know what? If you don't care, then you don't get to play anymore. And so he's sitting on the bench, and his head's in his hands, and he's off the side. And one of his teammates comes over and says, "Hey, coach, you know, he's not playing anymore after this because of you, because he doesn't like you. He's like, because these boys are like 16. He's like, we've played together since we were like 9, and he's done now. Do you think you could put him back in and let him finish the game so we can all play together? Because we're not going to win the game, and we're already eliminated from the tournament. And so can you put him back in? And that just like smashed me. And my first reaction was like, hell no, I'm not putting him back in, right? And he should be tougher, he should be stronger, he should whatever. And then I just look at this kid in the bench, and I'm like, I don't know if maybe I wasn't married that time. I didn't have my own kids, but maybe that was the first time I kind of looked at it and said, that's a human being there. That's not a soccer player. Yeah. Right. And I did. I went and talked to him, and I did put him back in, and it just took all the wind out of my sails that day. Of course, we still ended up losing the game 5-0 or something like that. But I just remember walking sort of when I was done with the game, and just kind of walking around the field, and just that moment just stuck with me. I mean, obviously till this day, of like, what was I doing? Like, what was my purpose here? And so to sort of like answer the second part of your question, yeah, at that point, right, here I was. I'd had, a short and not exciting playing career. I'd had, I'm coaching a strong Division I college team. I have teams that are having success on the field on, the youth level, and yet no one had ever in all that time talked about the psychological part of the game. And I'd started doing my coaching education, and in a 20-hour course, there'd be 1 hour on the sports psychology lecture. And for me, it was usually like, oh God, do we have to go to this? Can't I just get some more drills? Right. And, so it was this thing that had been hinted at, but it wasn't a part of what we did, and it was never on my radar as a coach or an athlete. And so maybe this was one of those moments that started opening the door to say, wow, if you can connect with them, in their minds and in their hearts, they're going to play a lot better. And look at that kid out there. Of course he's not playing well, because if I felt like that, I wouldn't play well either. And so, that was a really powerful moment, and that's why I started the book with that story.
And did that transformation, that coaching transformation, happen overnight following that incident, or was there still a period of sort of self-reflection and argument against yourself and negotiation against you or with yourself? Did it take a bit of time to change?
Am I not supposed to still be arguing with myself? And I think we're always on this journey, and so 100%, it was not like there wasn't unicorns and rainbows, and it wasn't like this like epiphany moment, right? I didn't see the white light and then come back to earth. It took a while, and I would say that if you talk to the players that I coached for the next number of years, they would certainly have some moments that they would say, John, that. But I think what I had from that moment on was maybe I demonstrated a lot more love in my coaching, right? Love of my players, right? And so when I was hard on them, when I might maybe lost it a little bit, there was a lot of currency built up, a lot of deposits on the positive side that maybe I would just made some quick withdrawals. And then I would say the coach I am today is really focused on a lot of those deposits. And every time something not constructive comes out, what I'm so much better at today, which would have never crossed my mind then, is to grab a kid and apologize, or to send them a note and saying, hey, I'm not sure that came out the right way. Perhaps, I should have said it this way. You're an important member of this team and you're doing really well. And, sometimes we all have a bad day, and today wasn't one of my best. So keep working hard, right? I would have never done that when I was 26, but I'm very intentional about doing that now.
And talking about being intentional, I mean, we live in a coaching world where we're quite insistent on players building character, but it feels like in that first lesson, and hey, we're only on the first lesson here, but it feels like in that first lesson that you've been quite insistent on the importance of coaches building character. So having that self-awareness piece, and then having the capacity to build character, develop yourself, essentially.
Exactly. And I think because when you develop your character, what it enables you to do is in these emotional moments that coaching is full of, in these moments of uncertainty, in these moments of stress, that you train yourself not to react, but to respond. Right. And we would, when we react to certain things, a bad call, a bad bounce, a bad foul, we stop coaching. Right. We stop teaching. We stop leading our players, and we also model to them. It's okay to be distracted now and spend your time yelling at the referee. Right. Instead of getting on with the game, getting on with the coaching. And so, I love this idea. The American football coach Urban Meyer, in one of his books, writes E plus R equals O. Event plus response equals outcome. And the R, the response, is a far greater effect upon the outcome of any than the event is.
Yeah.
Right. So bad things are going to happen, and I know this is a big thing about your work and mental frameworks and stuff. That you create this framework, you create this ability to respond no matter what happens, and I think this is so critical for coaches, and you can't do that until you have self-awareness of, well, how do I usually react, right? And how do I usually do things? And so this is big. This is just a big thing for me. And again, it doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean you don't ever screw up, but once you've been coaching a while, you should know what are the things that set me off and how do I prepare to respond better in those moments.
Well, it's that response piece that's so important, isn't it? And leading on to the second lesson, which refers to being athlete-centered. I'm just picking a little story that you tell in this second part, or second chapter, I should say. It revolves around Steve Kerr, and it possibly comes from your interview with Steve Kerr, which was brilliant. And Steve Kerr says, "When I think about Steph Curry, I immediately think about all the people who are demanding his time, and I think I've got to find a way to help Steph simplify his life and get some rest." And what that strikes me as, and what you're writing about, what Steve Kerr is saying, is that incumbent on me as a coach is to know my players, is to be athlete-centered, is to respect the fact that every player brings with him or her challenges. It's not always easy for them to manage or control their attitude. Hey, we have a good debate about that one, right, John? So that next chapter is very much to be able to help athletes respond appropriately, whatever that looks like. You've got to be a player-centered coach, or you've got to be an athlete-centered coach.
Correct. And the whole idea of that story that Steve Kerr tells, which the background of it, which is really interesting, is even though he won 5 NBA championships as a player and played under Phil Jackson with the Bulls and Greg Popovich with the Spurs and did great, but for almost for his whole career he was rarely, if ever, a starter. He always came off the bench. And so one of the things that he told us on the podcast was like, hey, because I was always a bench player, like I was very attuned to what it feels like to be there. And so, like you said, with Steph Curry, I have to help Steph simplify his life, get some rest, clear the distractions. But when I look at the 14th guy on the bench, his life is very different, right? This might be his last contract. He's trying to stay in the NBA. What's he going to do if he doesn't get another contract? The thing that's most important in his life is going to be gone. And so, that athlete needs help, needs advice, needs that confidence to keep going. And to think that you coach those two people exactly the same, or that you're going to reach them with exactly the same thing, that guy would love to be doing an interview at practice. But no one wants to interview him,
Yeah.
right? And so it's a totally different job. And the more that you understand what each person needs, the better you can reach them. And one of the challenges of coaching is, how do you serve the needs of every individual within the team context? And I think great coaches find ways to do that.
And what kind of things do you do to be more athlete-centric?
For me personally, right, given the level and the age that I coach right now, my kids have a lot going on in their life,
Yep.
right? And I've coached boys and girls and things like that. But like, for example, I coached, I had a girl who was, she was new to the game of soccer as a 11-year-old or so, but she was one of the best Irish dancers in the whole region of the United States.
Okay.
And so she had incredible feet, right? And she learned so fast. And her improvement was the best improvement in 2 years I've ever seen any kid make. It was amazing. But every once in a while, she'd be like, Coach, I have to go, and I have this regional dance competition. I won't be here for 2 weeks. I got to get ready for it, and then I'm flying here, there, or somewhere else, right? So letting her go. But then the first time that I would see her after that, I'd be like, hey, how'd your dance competition go? Tell me about it, right? So just that little thing to her, that I am in tune to her life outside of, what we're doing on the football pitch, is one way to do it. To show up at a kid's other sporting event in their life, to go to a graduation, or reach out, on something else going on. So being in tune to the other things that happen outside of what's happening on your field, on your training field, on your game field, and then just making those little comments, right? Taking that time before practice, getting around kid to kid, sending them that note, or, the kids that I work with, the age they are, just from a safe sport perspective. I'll usually send an email through their parents for the kid, so the parents are reading it and it's all above board. But just like, hey, you know what? I know you're frustrated today, but you've been working so hard, and I think you're going to see a big breakthrough soon. Keep it going, right? Just those couple words of confidence helps build them up and can stick with a kid for the next month. And so, that's the couple of the ways that I do it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that can be for 11 to 14-year-olds, and hey, that can work at the elite adult level as well. And I think you sum it up neatly in your lesson here when you say great coaches understand that coaching is a relationship business. They know that the sport-specific knowledge matters, but is not sufficient. It's 10 to 20% of what you do, and the other 80 to 90% is all about the person in front of you. And I'd like to ask you, John, because as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, you're somebody who travels the world, talking with coaches, lecturing, presenting, facilitating. How many of those coaches do you feel would share your opinion that 10 to 20% is what you do, I suppose the X's and O's, and the other 80 to 90% is all about the person in front of you?
Well, certainly, in that chapter, that 80-90% relationships is also a quote from Steve Kerr. So Steve Kerr would share my opinion. Anson Dorrance, I had Tony DeCicco, World Cup winning coach before, and Olympic champion before he passed away, was on the podcast, said the same thing. Every top championship coach that I've ever spoken to talks about how important those relationships are. Now, I think one of the things with elite sport is, because we get clips on Sky Sports, we get clips on ESPN, we see these little snapshots of the interaction. We don't see 99% of the coach-athlete interaction because it happens away from the cameras at practice, right, in the meeting in the office. And so we base our coaching on that one tirade on the sideline and say, well, so-and-so does it, so I should do that. But no, what happened to lead to that moment where that coach can get animated with that athlete, and that athlete will respond appropriately to it instead of just getting angry? So when I go and I travel and I I would say it's hard to say how. I would say that not too many coaches are aware of it, but one of the things that I do when sort of my first activity in a coaching talk, excuse me, I'll send every coach, I'll give every coach 5 sticky notes, and I'll ask them, write down the 5 qualities of the best coach you've ever had. And then we'll put them up on the wall, and I say, okay, over here, put all the sticky notes that have to do with your coach's knowledge of the sport, the tactics, technique, X's and O's. And over here, put all the sticky notes that have to do with your coach's ability to connect and all the emotional intelligence piece. And 80 to 90% of the sticky notes are always under connection, right? And so, when you've got 200 coaches in a room and, over 1,000 sticky notes are on one side and there's 150 on the other, because usually about a third of the room doesn't put any under the knowledge side of things. It's really hard to say, well, that's not what it's about. And so it's always funny. Everyone always breaks out their cameras at that point and they take pictures and they're like, okay. And that kind of sets the tone for the talk of, all the X's and O's. That kind of makes you a trainer. But I think coaching, that's the other stuff. And to be a great coach, these are skills you have to learn and develop as well.
Well, I agree, and I have to say it was a deeply unfair question. So sort of ask you to give me, say, like a percentage of the number of coaches you feel agree or disagree. But I think you've neatly summed it up, and I think that there are a lot of coaches out there through in many respects no fault of their own, that their definition of coaching lends itself more towards the 10 to 20% that you talk about, what Steve Kerr has talked about, rather than to the 80 to 90%. And it's often, again, if we link it back to your experience as a player, coaches tend to coach from the template by which they were coached themselves, and the experiences they had growing up playing and competing. And we're still going through, I think, a period, it'd be interesting to get your comment, Edge, on a period of transition in the coaching world, a period of transition in the sporting world, where slowly but surely coaches, governing bodies, organisations, coaches are starting to understand the importance of the psychosocial side, and they're slowly nudging towards that 80-90%. And it will certainly be interesting to see the next generation of coaches coming through who have had a greater exposure to the psychosocial side.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think there's other things in our life that make that happen. I mean, how many stories have you heard about people saying, oh, that coach really changed when he or she had their own kids, right? So when you have your own children and you're like, all of a sudden you're like, this is the most important thing in the world to me, this little human being. Of course I care about how he or she is treated, right? And all of a sudden it hits you like, wow, the way that I'm, talking to this athlete or interacting in this moment, what if someone did that to my own kid? How would I feel, right? So why should I do it to someone else's kid, right? And I always say, like, I coached a long time before I had children, so sorry to all those parents. I got to practice on their kids before having my own. But I think, again, that can't help but affect the way that you treat other people, especially young people, when you're working with them. I think you're right, Dan, that there's going to be a shift because we tend to coach how we were coached.
Yeah.
And most young coaches, more so than that, they're even stronger because it's so fresh in their minds how they were coached. Yeah. And so I think it's rare the young coach who is thinking deeply about the psychosocial piece, unless they got a degree in psychology or something like that, in which case it's probably at the forefront of their mind.
Absolutely. And that first section, you have 3 lessons. We've spoken about the first 2, and that third lesson is the goal is to win, the purpose is something much deeper. that concludes the why part. But it feels, John, and it feels, whether it's reading your book or just emanating from you and knowing about you and what you do on Way of Champions and what you've done in the past decade, it feels like the why is the biggest thing here. It might even be the shortest section, but it feels like the biggest thing, that the purpose is something much deeper than winning and X's and O's.
That's exactly it, Dan. And again, I think in the grand scheme of things, if you get the why right, everything else seems to follow. And you also have, these guiding principles. Your tactics and your strategies can change, but your principles and what matters to you, that's the foundation. And so I think there's nothing more important as a coach than being strong there. And again, I put that section first because I think most coaches who've done, coaching education courses know that you go straight to the how. You go straight to the tactical part. You go straight to the technical training, and a lot of times you skip that. I can't think I've ever been asked, to come up with my why in a coaching course, except one that I've run, right? And so, but when you do, all of a sudden, again, it's not sexy and it's hard to measure, but it's really I think the foundation and fundamental to what you do.
Absolutely. And moving on to part two, the how do I coach? I mean, I'm still, perhaps I'm biased, John, but as a sports psychologist who has a propensity to try to sell in the notion that everything is driven psychosocially, I still feel that the how is driven psychosocially, and I still, again, throughout your lessons in this part, I still feel the same way. And it's interesting, you open up this section by talking about effective learning environments, and you certainly mention a few people I know and have conversed with: Andrew Wilson, who's an ecological psychologist, and Todd Bean, Trevor Reagan from the Learning Lab, in this lesson 4. Talk to us a bit about effective learning environments, because for me, learning is still psychosocial.
Well, it is. And, I had a guy on the podcast, Fergus Connolly, who's a high performance coach. And he said to me a while back, he was like, he said, he goes, I consider psychology just physiology that we haven't figured out how to measure yet, right?
Yeah.
So, I kind of like that, right? We don't have the machine to get into the brain there yet, but it is something physiological, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. But I think, again, as a coach, right, I've yet to meet a coach on any level who says, I have more training time than I need. Can I give some back? Right. So if this is the case, then the quality of those moments that we have with our athletes is amongst the most important things, because we don't get the quantity that we want. And this is even at the highest level. And this, Dan, right? It's like, how often do you really have a full-on training session when you're not either recovering for a game or you're the day before a game, right? Because of all the cups and all the other things that you play. So you're always you're always searching for when are those moments when we can really dial in here and make this our best. And so there's a lot of mythology out there about learning hacks and learning shortcuts and all this sort of stuff. But really the only learning that is scientifically peer reviewed, that is, super effective, concepts in learning are what we call interleaving, spacing, and quizzing, and desirable difficulties, right? So interleaving our practice, which is, repetition without repetition. We don't want to repeat, you would know this as a golfer, right?
Yep.
Hitting 57 irons in a row. If you hit 57 irons in a round of golf. Well, okay, let's say 10 7-irons on the range, you might make the same exact swing. 10 7-irons in a round of golf, you're going to make 10 different swings based on your lie, the pin position, all that sort of stuff, right? So one is not great training for the other. So interleaving our practice, and especially in dynamic games like football and ice hockey and lacrosse and basketball, where you're never playing the same pass twice, and everything is about reading situations and coming up with solutions and adding deception and technically executing and assessing choices, right? These things happen over and over and over. We need to create training environments that have that stuff. We need to create training environments that we come back to things that we learned before right at the point when they're going to forget it, and we force them to retrieve it, right? So, we don't necessarily cue it up for them. We set up the same scenario, the same activity that we did in practice, and instead of throwing all the cues and say this is exactly what we're looking for, we roll out the ball and we say play the game. And if they start demonstrating the things we've worked on, great, that means they've learned it. And if they don't, well, guess what? They haven't learned it even though you've taught it. And so, but stretching for that retrieval, right, going into their mind and pulling back up like, oh, wait, this is how we run this fast break, right? This is the breakout in ice hockey. This is that play in lacrosse, right? That act of retrieval actually makes learning stickier. And so what, in a nutshell, what the science would say is that slow learning is sticky learning. And if you block or mass your practice and you do a whole ton of stuff today, it will look better today, but they won't remember it 2 weeks from now. And this is what the Andrew Wilsons and the Mark Uptons of the world, this is what all the research shows. And so we have to create environments that are hard, that are challenging, that are ugly, as Trevor Reagan would say, that have stretch and don't necessarily, have players leaving practice going, man, we aced that, but leaving practice going, man, that was hard. We weren't very good today, but that is actually sticky learning. And this is one of our challenges, right? Because if you're coaching, especially if you're coaching youth and you've got parents who are watching practice, they love lines and cones and order, and yet chaos is what promotes learning, not order.
It's interesting as you're speaking there. I've felt over the years that sometimes coaches have been guilty of assessing the quality of their coaching session, their training or practice session via, let's say, intensity, especially in team invasion sports. My players are training with real intensity. That was great. So that was real intensity. What I hear you say and what I read in your lesson about effective learning environments is it's more about thinking the game. It's thinking in action. It's setting problems so players have to think, and then perhaps testing that thinking, testing the solution finding, whether that's later in the training session or even a week later or even 2 weeks later. You want players to think. That's what it sounds like to me.
100%. I mean, that's exactly it. And again, the more dynamic, or I use the words from a researcher named Robin Hogarth, who says, right, that there's two worlds: a kind world and a wicked world, right? And a wicked world would be like soccer, football, lacrosse, ice hockey, basketball, these constant fast-moving invasion games, where kind world might be chess, right? And every sport falls somewhere along that spectrum. But the more wicked your sport is, the more decisions have to be made. And so, I've never met a coach who says, I don't want any creative decision makers. Well, if the game is all about executing decisions and making decisions and coming up with them, then your practice has to look like that. Your practice, as a young coach, I was led to believe that it was all about touches, right? Get as many touches as possible. And now my practices are geared around get as many decisions as possible. And when you get a lot of touches or a lot of interactions, and they're combined with a lot of decisions that are highly representative of what the competition environment looks like, it's going to transfer, right? It's going to transfer from training to the game. And a lot of practices, sadly, when you go and watch them, they're practices for the sake of looking good in practice, and there's no transferable elements to them, right? Kids passing a ball back and forth and pass and run to the end of the next line and things like that. that's not transferring, because you would never ever once do that in a game.
11 to 14-year-olds is where you specialise. Are there many times that you set out activities that aren't very representative?
Just to break out like a technique that they're struggling with, you mean?
Yeah, so would you invest at all in activities that aren't representative, that are a bit, or lack? I should say everything is representative to a degree, isn't it? It lacks representation.
I certainly try not to, because again, like all coaches, right? I don't have a lot of training time. I get about 4 hours a week with my kids, 3 to 4 hours a week, and so why would we gather as a group to play by ourselves, right? So it's like, what I want to do in training is demonstrate to kids, right, what am I struggling with the hope that then they'll go home and pick up a ball and find a wall and work on that first touch, or go to the practice range in golf and work on something that they haven't been doing well, right? And so this is this is what I believe practice is for, is that when we gather in groups, we play in groups, and when we get and then it teaches us what we need to work on our own. Now, this is not to say I never pull out something quick and say, okay, let's really 5 minutes here, like either with an individual kid, right? Hey, come here. You guys knock some balls back and forth because you're not hitting it correctly. You're not locking your ankle. You're not hitting it with your laces. Your plant foot's in the wrong place, whatever it is. It's not to say that I never do that, or I don't say, okay, let's just, mix this in here real quick. But again, the issue is the vast majority of my practice has to be representative on some level. Now, it can't all be a 10 out of 10, right? But I need to be working constantly on, making it each little piece a little bit more representative in practice. This is there's a great book, Constraints-Led Approach, Ian Renshaw and his colleagues, and they talk about having a dial, 0 being not representative and 10 being, Game 7 of the World Series, ninth inning, 3-2 count, right? You're always someplace on that spectrum. And so your challenge as a coach is, where am I with this activity? And if it's a 2, how can I make it 2 a 4, right? And so, passing in soccer, instead of pass and follow your pass to a line, can you not get repetitions of a technique playing a 4v1 rondo, where at least you have to be aware of a defender and what foot to receive the ball on, and, scan and look for your support before you get the ball and adjust your feet to support the pass that you play. And you're still getting tons of repetitions of a pass and that technique, but you're doing it within a semi-transferable environment. Is that a 9 out of 10? No, right? But it's certainly better than pass and follow your pass to the next line.
Did you develop your game that way growing up? And if not, would you have been a better player if you had?
I think early on, I think I was very lucky with the coaches I had. And it's funny, I mean, being 48 years old, I have so few memories of what practice was like as a kid. but I do feel like, I had, when I was really, really young, I had an amazing coach who just made it fun, and was also, he was a good player, and we learned stuff, but I just remember laughing a lot with him and really loving the game. He also taught me golf, so 2 games that I'm still involved in. Oh. He was my teacher for both, right? And but I do remember in high school, sort of my 2 or 3 most influential coaches, it was all like tons of small-sided game things. We did a ton of that. One was an Israeli international, and one was an Austrian international, and he became my university coach as well. And we just played a lot. Now, I think with him, like, there could have been more, discussion of the why are we doing this, or the why of that but we played a lot. And I remember as a player, it's much more fun to show up and play than it is to stand in line. So you can go too far in that direction, and then people don't learn enough because they don't know why they're doing it. But if you're going to err on one side, erring on the side of dynamic game environments is far better than erring on the side of one kid, one ball, or two kids, one ball, no defenders, no decisions, no direction, all that, in my opinion. And I think the research backs that up.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. And it's a lovely chapter, lovely lesson to neatly sum up the research and some of your opinions that you've spelt out there. And I just want to move on to lesson 6, which is a personal favourite of mine, John, because this is my one of the big things I talk about in my work. So lesson 6 is called Win the Day. With the subtitle of Don't Show Up to Win, Show Up to Compete. So I was reading it and thinking, well done, John O'Sullivan. This is awesome. I love that message. Don't show up to win, show up to compete. But, well, look, why don't we get your interpretation of what that means? Tell us about lesson 6.
Well, sure. One of the stories I tell in there is Cindy Timshall, who is the winningest lacrosse coach of all time, tied John Wooden for the most national championships in a row at 7, has won 8 of them. Just unbelievable women's lacrosse coach now at the U.S. Naval Academy. But, what she talked about in there is, and Anson Dorrance from North Carolina women's soccer, right, is that, we have to create, first of all, in our practice environments, we have to create environments where we are focused on the process, or we're focused on here and now. And if we can make this the most competitive day of the year, and we can link a lot of those days together, the games get easy. Right. And I, this is really influential to me. I mean, I tell my teams when I first take over, our first couple months, we're going to learn how to practice. Because when we get good at practice, then we're going to start seeing results on the scoreboard in games. And it's amazing, right? Like if you coach a youth sport, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners do, how many kids will miss practices all the time, but then we're always available for the game. But we don't plan on coming to practice this week. And it's kind of like, you're better off the other way. Just come to training and skip the game, and so really what this comes down to is this idea of if you show up to win, what happens is, you're focused on the outcome. You're focused on uncontrollables like weather and officials and stuff like that. You get really tight, tentative, because you just don't control these things. All this stuff is out of your you don't have any influence over it. And so that's a situation that breeds a lack of confidence, right? Whereas when you show up to compete, right, that's focusing on the process, doing all the little things, controlling the controllables, responding when things happen. And that is a much more confident state to play in, because you're just focusing on the things that you can influence. It calms you down. It relaxes you. It doesn't make you worried about what might happen. It just keeps you focused on what's happening right now. Because in any competitive event, something's going to go sideways all the time. And I think if we go beyond sports teams into true high-performing teams, which would be like the Navy SEALs or NASA astronauts, this is what they do as well, right? They train for not when things go right, but what happens when things go wrong. And, so this is something that I work very hard with young kids on is, focus on the now, focus on the process. Don't worry about that other stuff. What do you control? What do you control? Write your own story. And I think when you do that, you give yourself the best chance of playing up to your potential.
Yeah, look, we've spoken about this on your podcast, and when you talk about process, I talk about, I completely agree, and I remember writing in Soccer Tough, the me, the now, the process, and these days I call it a mental skills framework. You mentioned that earlier, mm-hmm. So I'm, I think we're completely singing from the same song sheet there, and something I also say is that for me, I use you talked about a dial in terms of representational dial, as introduced by Ian Renshaw and Danny Newcomb in their Constraints-led book, which is a brilliant book as well. And
I didn't mean to leave Daddy and Will and those
yeah,
guys
Danny
out.
Will,
Keith
and,
out. Yeah.
Keith Davis. They're pretty big players in that world, and great theorists and practitioners. And the previous two chapters really feel. I talk about two dials, coaches having a stretch dial and a support dial, and it feels like you open the how of coaching very much with a hand on the stretch dial, going to compete, and also creating effective learning environments. And now in Lesson 7, it feels like the hand's a bit more on the support dial. Lesson 7 is entitled, Make Your Athletes Feel Invaluable, Even If They're Not the Most Valuable. Make your athletes feel invaluable, even if they're not the most valuable. Talk to us about creating a positive, inclusive environment.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing, especially when we're talking about the bigger picture of sport development, right, and keeping children active and involved in sport, is they have to feel like, hey, I have a role. Most kids are okay with not being the best player out there, right, as long as they feel valued. And I remember, I have a friend, Ken, he's a high school athletic director, and he said, the best advice I got was when I was starting out as an athletic director, was all your problems are going to come from two things: playing time and recognition. He's like, you've only got so much playing time to hand out, right? You've only got so many minutes in the game where people can get minutes, but all coaches can be better at recognition. And if we are, again, intentionality, this is a word that comes up a lot. If we are intentional about our giving that recognition, making people feel valued, acknowledging their contribution, even if it's not scoring 25 points or scoring 3 goals or making 10 saves, we can still acknowledge their contribution, even when they recognize that, I might not be playing much here. And so I think this is really understanding then, why do your athletes play, what they want from you as coaches, what are the things that take that joy away, like losing patience and stuff. And then, for a lot of coaches, oftentimes we only intervene when to fix things, to critique things. But, one of the things that I learned from Tony DeCicco, catch them being good, right? What if your stoppages are, stop there. Do you see that run you made? Do you see how that opened that space for her and we got a shot? Congratulations. That's awesome. Keep doing that. Right? So if you also acknowledge the good behavior, people are going to repeat that as well, right? They will give back to you what gets them praise. And so don't just be a critiquer, but catch them being good as well. And this is, I think, sometimes harder in practice. It's much easier when it all blows up and the ball rolls out of bounds to go, oh, okay, stop, let me fix it. But when something good happens and it ends up in the back of the net, just say, hey, stop. Did you see that run he made there? Did you see that ball you played? Right? Do you see how you set that ball and then spun off or whatever? That's awesome. That's exactly what we're looking for. Keep doing that, right? And that's going to get more of that behavior and make kids feel good. Or adults.
Yeah, look, yes, absolutely. Their needs, human needs, are exactly the same, John, in many respects. I completely believe that. But what you're saying allows us to neatly move on to part 3, which is entitled, How Does It Feel to Be Coached by Me? How does it feel to be coached by me? You're talking about things there, making coaching points or making positive human-centered points, and that links in nicely with how does it feel to be coached by me? And I think that's a question that coaches don't ask themselves enough. They don't necessarily reflect back enough on and put themselves into boots or the shoes, the sneakers, the trainers of their players, and use their imagination and ask themselves that question: what would it be like if I was actually coached by me? It's a great question, John. And what made you write that as sort of the main heading of part 3?
Well, again, I grabbed these 4 questions from Joe Ehrman, Inside Out Coaching, of like, hey, or these questions, right? How, why do I coach? Why do I coach the way that I coach? I think is how he calls it, and what does it feel like to be coached by me? And I think they're really, really powerful. And certainly that third question, again, I have this opportunity to get in front of thousands of coaches a year as a speaker, and whenever I put that question up, everyone writes it down. Like you see the light bulb going off of like, wow, I never really thought about that. And I would be the first to point the finger at myself and say, I never really thought about that as a young coach. Wow, I didn't even care what it felt like to be coached by me. I just cared that you worked hard and that we won games. But when understanding, right, why does it, how does it feel like here? It just becomes much more fulfilling as a coach when you can go and sleep at night because you feel like, man, kids love coming here, right? And again, I keep defaulting back to the age that I'm coaching, but this is no different from collegiate coaches, professional coaches. If it feels great to come to work every day, right? If you're a pro, you're going to play better. Even in the book, or on the podcast, Steve Kerr told this story of, sitting down with Pete Carroll, the American football coach from Seattle, and figuring out, and Pete Carroll asking him, like, what's it, how are you going to coach? And Steve was like, what do you mean? Like, what offense, what defense we're going to run? And Pete Carroll's like, no. He goes, what's it going to feel like when people show up on part of your team? He's like, that matters more than the offense and the defense. And he helped Steve come up with sort of the 4 things that were authentically most important to him about what the Golden State Warriors environment was going to feel like. And those 4 values are joy, competitiveness, compassion, and mindfulness, right? The most important thing at the Golden State Warriors is joy. And Steve's like, you know what? If people are showing up here and not enjoying themselves, they're not going to play well. And if they're not having fun, I'm not going to have fun as a coach. And so this matters to me. And you know what? If we show up and we have these things and we don't win, I'm okay with that. I'll go home and I'll sleep well at night because I know the things that really matter to me. And so I think as a coach, knowing what matters to you, coming up authentically with, what it's supposed to feel like in your environment, coming up with those core values alongside of your team of like, what are the non-negotiables for this group? That again is foundational. And oftentimes I get coaches saying, I don't have time to do that. But I would argue that you don't have time not to do that because it'll make your practices that much, higher quality.
I always remember being in the audience at a Butch Harmon conference. This is going back about 15 years when I was actually a PGA golf professional, and I'm sure most of the audience will recognise the name Butch Harmon. He was Tiger Woods' coach, Greg Norman, and Phil Mickelson for a bit, Ricky Fowler. He's coached everybody, right? But I always remember him saying his father was Claude Harmon, who won the Masters twice, I think maybe back in the 50s. And he was also Claude Harmon because it was a period of time when these guys would play the tour but also be a club pro somewhere, and he was a club pro in New York. I've forgotten what the course is, a very famous course in New York.
Wingfoot or something, probably.
Yeah, something. It was I can't remember, but I remember Butch Harmon just talking about, it's obviously a great conference on how he coaches players. He got to the part about giving a talk about his father, and he said his father was a wonderful teacher, wonderful coach, but he said that the number one lesson his father taught him was, the art of saying hello to everybody and being friendly and being alert to people's needs. And Butch Harmon said this is far more important than any laws, principles and preferences. And laws, principles and preferences happens to be a very prominent coaching model in golf. But he said, look, this is far more important. This is the number one thing that I do to establish and maintain relationships. And it strikes me, in this part of but the whole book is that's a lot of what you're saying. Is that feels like the definition of success for you, which I know is that's part 4 of the book, is you're giving us a new definition of success. Yeah,
for sure. And I think it goes back to, right, these critical ingredients of sport performance, joy, ownership, mastery, and those things breed intrinsic motivation, right? And as a young coach, like I would look at like my job is to make sure every one of these kids has this stuff, right? And then I realized, and I've been lucky enough that some of the kids that I have coached have, made national teams and played professionally in Europe and in Major League Soccer and certainly, tons of them on the collegiate level, is that, my job is to create an environment where they love this so much that they're going to go home and pick up a ball and practice on their own, right? And actually, as coaches, we can be more inhibitors than facilitators, right? Like, I think, people who make it as a top, they make it on their own and they get some help along the way, but it's not because of us, right? Oftentimes it's in spite of that coach who takes away the creativity or whatever. And so I think creating that environment where they feel welcome, where they look forward to showing up, where they then want to go and get better because you have taught them, hey, you see why this isn't working, try this, go work on it on your own. That is the pathway to true mastery and getting really good at something. And again, that's, like I'd say, how do we define success? I think, the way that I define success as coaches is not how many state championships I win, but how many of those kids would invite me to their wedding 15 years in the future, right? How many of them want me to go to their graduation? Just this week, I had 2 kids that I coach who they're 25 now and actually decided to, coach their own team because they're teachers. And they said, can we sit down and chat? I want some advice. Like, hey, wow, they turned to me on their first coaching job. So I think maybe I've done something right for them. And I think these are the things, right, that we're creating our own coaching tree as well, right? If we look at the people in front of us as this is the future of my sport because 10 of these kids might be coaching someday, what am I leaving them with? If I really love the game of, soccer, then this is the future of the game because they're going to teach that, if I can get my love and passion for the game across to these guys, that when they coach their own kids someday, they'll get that love and passion of the game across to their kids, and they'll know how to create an environment that feels good. I mean, these are the ways that I think success is defined much more so than some trophy collecting dust on your mantle.
Well said, John. Brilliant. How can people get hold of this fantastic new book of yours?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely every moment matters. Amazon is the best way to do it. I think that's just the most international way
Yes.
to find it there. But your local library or bookstore can also carry it as well. If they don't have it, they can certainly get it. Or you can come, my website is changingthegameproject.com, and you can get an autographed copy from me on there if you want. And just, if you go to the website, you get our information, you'll find the Way Champions podcast on there as well. And, we have a good Facebook community and Twitter community as well. But yeah, if you want this book, go to Amazon. That would be great.
If people want to get hold of you on Twitter or Facebook, how can they do so?
Sure. I invite all your listeners, connect with me directly, John, John, at changingthegameproject.com. That is my email. It goes straight to my inbox. And I do travel a lot, but I always try to get back to you as quickly as possible. That's the best way to kind of connect with me. And then Twitter and Instagram is at CTG Project HQ. That's our handle there. And Facebook, just look for Changing the Game Project. You'll find that community there as well. We also have a great community called Coaching Mastery Group, about 1,000 coaches in sort of a private Facebook group as well. You can find that on there too.
Brilliant. Well, John, it's been an honor and a pleasure being the interviewer rather than the interviewee.
Well, you're excellent at it, and I want to give your podcast a shout out as well. You are often in my ear on long drives, airplanes, and I like to mountain bike. And so between you and Stuart Armstrong and Trevor Reagan, you guys get most of my uphills.
Poor you, listen to my dulcet tones in your ear. Nightmare. Okay, well, look, John, thank you so much for taking some time to come on the Sports Psych Show. That was brilliant. And everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.